Hello, grade 10s. So today we're going to be looking at the end of World War I, and more specifically, what the Treaty of Versailles was. So I'm going to show my screen here, and we're going to be looking at these four main points. What was the Treaty of Versailles? What was the League of Nations? What was the Russian Revolution? And what were the seeds for World War II? So, as some of you may know, World War I ended November 11th, 1918. The Triple Entente, which was Britain, France, Canada, they were victorious in the war. The Triple Alliance were defeated. So after the war, the victorious countries met in Paris at the Paris Peace Conference, where there they decided how they were going to end the war and what policies would be in place in the future. So looking at the big four, which were the four main leaders of this conference, was Woodrow Wilson from the United States, David Lloyd George from Great Britain, George Clemenceau from France, and Vito Orlando from Italy. Now, looking at what these gentlemen had in what they wanted to achieve in this conference, George Clemenceau wanted revenge. He wanted reparations from Germany, mainly because World War I was mainly fought on French soil. He wanted to make sure another war wouldn't happen in France. David Lloyd George, on the other hand, he wanted to make sure his empire was still intact after World War I. As we know, Great Britain was the largest empire in the world, and he wanted to make sure he could still trade with his international trading partners. Also, we can see here it says the fear of communism. At this time, Russia became the first communist state in the world. David Lloyd George wanted to make sure that communism didn't spread not only to the island of Great Britain, but also that communism didn't spread to his empire. If that happened, a lot of his economic stability would suffer. The last person we'll look at is Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson went to the Paris Peace Conference to make sure Germany was punished, but not severely. He came up with the 14 points, which outlined ways of how they should proceed after the war. Through his points, he did claim that Germany should take responsibility for the war, but also not severely taking penalties. What this meant is he called it just settlement, which meant that Germany should pay for their involvement in the war, but they shouldn't feel resentment, because if they do, they're going to want to have revenge and maybe start another war later on. He also formed the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations was a group of countries that were supposed to form and meet anytime future conflicts came together and avoid future wars. The League of Nations didn't really succeed because the United States actually didn't support this policy. Woodrow Wilson came up with the idea, but his government back at home didn't support him and didn't fund this agency. This is mainly because the United States was going through a period of isolationists, meaning they only focused on what was happening in America. On a side note, the League of Nations actually is still around today in some capacity. It is now known as the United Nations. So the Treaty of Versailles, what was that? The Treaty of Versailles was mainly written towards Germany, telling them what they must, or what their penalties are for starting World War I. So the first point that they had was the War Guilt Clause, known as Article 231. This forced Germany to say they were responsible for all of World War I. The second was the territorial losses. As we know at this time, imperialism was a big factor as why the war started, and Germany lost all of its imperialist land. So if you look at the top left corner here of this map, Germany lost all of its colonies. So that was a big dent into their economic gains after the war. We're also looking here at the border of France and Germany. This is called the Rhineland. This was a land that was given back to France, and also no army could occupy this. No German army could occupy this land. Another one we're going to look at is the east side here. This is what we call West Prussia. This was actually given to the League of Nations and was there to allow Poland to have access to the sea, giving them more sea access. Another territorial loss was Austria and Hungary, who are also part of the Triple Alliance. They were forced to break up, so they became Austria and Hungary. Also, they were forbidden to ally with Germany at this time. The third point that from this Treaty of Versailles we should take away is the reparation payments. Germany had to pay $30 billion to the Triple Entente to pay for the damages and suffering from the war. The last one we'll look at is the military limitations. Germany's army was forced to reduce from about 4 million soldiers to 100,000 soldiers after the Paris Peace Conference. Also, they could not build any more air force, they could not build any large ships, and all the U-boats or submarines that they built during the war, there was no more production being allowed. Also, again, that Rhineland, that demilitarized zone, this land here, Germany could not have any military in that area on the border with France. So, how did the people of Germany feel about the Treaty of Versailles? They felt what they call the stab in the back, meaning that the Germans felt betrayed by their leaders for accepting and not fighting harder to make the penalties weaker or more sustainable for them. Another thing we have to look at this point, as a side note, is that this time Russia was going through the 1917 Russian Revolution. Vladimir Lenin, who successfully overthrew the government in Russia, became the first communist leader of a state. We also have to know at this time that Russia actually withdrew from World War I before the end, so they were actually not involved in this Treaty of Versailles. Another thing while the Treaty of Versailles was going on, and we mentioned with David Lloyd George, is there was also this fear of communism going through at the time. So a lot of these policies were making sure that communism couldn't spread to other countries around the world. So what is this legacy of the Treaty of Versailles? So looking at here, some people actually say that the Treaty of Versailles marked the end of World War I, but also marked the start of World War II. Why do we say this? Because in 1919, Germany left with this Treaty of Versailles having felt humiliation, having felt failure towards their government, and also a feeling of revenge, which we're going to see start building up over the next couple of years. So the last point I want to make is, was the treaty too harsh? And I took this quote from the textbook saying, "We shall have to fight another war all over again in 25 years at 3 times the cost." David Lloyd George said this in 1919, and looking forward, we'll find out that in 1939, he was correct.